Let me ask you something. When you think of power, which nations come to mind? The United States, China, Russia. But what if I told you there's another nation, once overlooked, once underestimated, that is now quietly reshaping the entire global order? What if I told you it's India? But there's another story unfolding, one that almost no one is prepared for. And today I'm going to take you inside that story. Stay with me, because by the end of this you'll understand exactly why India is the nation everyone fears. Now let's start with the first clue, the awakening of a sleeping giant. Not too long ago, India's economy was dismissed as slow, moving, tangled in red tape, impossible to modernize. But in the last decade, it did something no one expected. It began to roar awake. This wasn't just growth. It was a transformation. Hundreds of millions lifted from poverty, new cities rising almost overnight, a middle class larger than the entire population of the United States. But that's only the surface, because as the world was busy watching trade wars between the US and China, India was quietly becoming the world's fastest growing major economy. The sleeping giant had woken up. But you're probably wondering, economic growth alone doesn't make a nation feared. You're right, it doesn't. So, let's peel back the next layer. Military might no one saw coming. For decades, India's military was seen as large but outdated. Suddenly, that perception is obsolete. India is now the world's largest arms importer and one of the few countries investing in indigenous fighter jets, nuclear submarines, ballistic missiles, and space weapons. Consider this, India launched a successful anti-satellite missile test. That means they can now target and destroy satellites in space, something only a handful of nations have achieved. When this happened, defense strategists worldwide realized India wasn't just catching up. It was leapfrogging ahead. But even that isn't the whole picture. While nations were distracted, India ignited a technological revolution. This is where the story gets even more unpredictable. India has become the world's digital backbone. Home to over 1 billion mobile connections, the largest biometric database ever created, and an innovation ecosystem spawning unicorn startups at breakneck speed. Ask yourself, when was the last time you read about an Indian tech company in the headlines? It's happening more than you realize. From fintech to AI, India isn't following trends, it's setting them. Yet still, this isn't the complete answer to why India inspires fear. Because you can have an economy, an army, and a tech sector, but unless you have something deeper, none of it lasts. That something is cultural confidence. India's young generation, over 600 million people, is unapologetically ambitious. They no longer measure themselves by Western standards. They believe in their heritage, their potential, and their destiny to lead. This is the psychological shift that makes a country unstoppable. But hold on, because the most strategic piece is yet to come. Strategic diplomacy. India is not aligning itself blindly with any single power bloc. Instead, it is balancing relationships with the US, Russia, Europe, Japan, and even engaging with China when necessary. This diplomatic dance is frustrating traditional powers. You can't pressure India into submission. You can't isolate it, and that is exactly why nations are wary. By now, you may be feeling the pieces clicking together, but there's one final element, the one no analyst can quantify. Yet every leader senses it. It is the power everyone underestimated, resilience. India has survived colonialism, partition, wars, poverty, and still it rises. While others decline, India adapts. When crises strike, India doesn't fracture. It endures. That is the essence of fear in the hearts of those who thought India would stay a follower forever. So here's the truth finally revealed. India is feared not because it is aggressive, but because it is inevitable, because for the first time in centuries the world is realizing this nation will no longer be ignored. And if you think this rise can be stopped, history will prove you wrong again. The question isn't whether India is coming. The question is, are you ready for it? India's transformation didn't happen with loud declarations or instant revolutions. It began with subtle, often overlooked shifts that gathered momentum over decades. In the early 1990s, India cracked open the door to economic reforms. Those reforms were cautious at first, tentative steps to escape decades of stagnation. But behind them was a deeper hunger to become self-reliant, to compete, to rise from the label of a developing nation into a formidable force. As the years passed, this hunger turned into a quiet determination. Industries began to modernize. The service sector exploded. Information technology companies, once small outsourcing shops, evolved into global leaders powering banks, hospitals, and governments around the world. Millions of young Indians learned coding, management, and entrepreneurship, building a human capital engine so vast that it started to change the balance of power in the global economy. At the same time, infrastructure projects began transforming cities. Roads, ports, airports, and power plants appeared where only decay had stood. Foreign investments poured in as companies realized India was no longer a market you could ignore. Slowly, India's GDP growth rate started to outpace older economies. But the most profound shift happened in mindset. A country long associated with poverty and limitations began to see itself differently. Aspirations grew. Middle-class families began to believe their children could have futures as good or better than any in the West. This shift wasn't an overnight miracle. It was the awakening of a giant that had been underestimated for too long. And once a giant starts to move, you can't pretend it's still asleep. You have to confront the reality that it has begun to claim its place in the world. For decades, military analysts and foreign policy makers viewed India as a nation with sheer size but limited capability. Its armed forces were large, yes, but reliant on outdated equipment and slow procurement processes. But as India's economic power grew, so did its ambition to modernize its defense posture. And this time, it wasn't just about catching up. It was about forging an entirely new reputation as a credible military power. Billions of dollars were invested to upgrade fighter jets, tanks, naval vessels, and missile systems. India launched indigenous defense projects determined to reduce dependence on imports and create homegrown technology that rivaled the world's best. The country developed the Tejas combat aircraft, deployed the Arihant-class nuclear submarines, and refined its ballistic missile arsenal, including the Agni series capable of striking far beyond its borders. One of the most defining moments came when India conducted an anti-satellite weapons test demonstrating it had the capability to destroy satellites in orbit. Few nations possess that kind of power projection. It was a clear message. India had entered an elite club of military technological capability. Beyond hardware, India has been strengthening its strategic doctrines and building partnerships with nations like the United States, France, Israel, and Japan to gain access to advanced systems and joint exercises. It is no longer content to be a regional force alone. It is signaling that it will defend its interests across the Indian Ocean and beyond. These developments didn't happen overnight, but the result is unmistakable. India is no longer seen as an outdated military giant stuck in the past. It is a modernizing force that nations must now factor into every calculation. And that is exactly why so many are beginning to fear its rise. While the world fixated on Silicon Valley and China's tech juggernaut, India was quietly laying the groundwork for a technological transformation that would shock skeptics. This wasn't just about outsourcing call centers or low-cost coding work anymore. It was a strategic shift to position India as an innovation hub in its own right. At the heart of this revolution was India's massive investment in digital infrastructure. The country built the world's largest biometric identification system, Aadhaar, which enrolled over 1 billion citizens and created an entirely new digital ecosystem. Suddenly, people who had never held a bank account could access digital payments and subsidies with a fingerprint scan. This leapfrog in inclusion wasn't merely a domestic achievement. It inspired governments worldwide to study how India accomplished it at such scale. Meanwhile, India's startup scene exploded. Young entrepreneurs launched companies in fintech, health tech, renewable energy, and artificial intelligence. In a span of a few years, India went from having only a handful of unicorns to dozens with valuations in the billions of dollars. Companies like Paytm, Flipkart, Byju's, and Ola became household names, reshaping industries and challenging multinational giants on their own turf. Tech talent became one of India's most formidable exports. Indian engineers began to occupy leadership positions in some of the world's most influential companies, from Google to Microsoft. But the real story was happening inside India itself. A generation of innovators proving they no longer had to leave home to build something world-class. This technological ascent wasn't loud or flashy at first, but it was relentless. And as the pieces came together, 1 billion connected consumers, a culture of entrepreneurship, and an ambitious government, India emerged as a tech powerhouse that global competitors could no longer ignore or underestimate. Something profound was happening beneath the economic statistics and military upgrades. For decades, many Indians measured success by how closely they could emulate Western ways, how well they could speak English, how easily they could fit into someone else's framework of modernity. But slowly that mindset began to erode. A new generation emerged that didn't feel compelled to apologize for who they were or where they came from. Young Indians started to see their heritage as an asset, not a burden. They drew confidence from thousands of years of civilization, philosophy, and art. Instead of trying to blend in, they began to stand out, proudly showcasing Indian culture, fashion, and ideas on the world stage. Bollywood became a global phenomenon not because it copied Hollywood, but because it dared to be unapologetically itself. Indian music, food, and festivals spread to every continent. Carried by a diaspora that no longer saw itself as guests in other countries, but as ambassadors of a vibrant civilization inside India. This cultural self-belief transformed everything. It shaped politics, business, and education. Entrepreneurs didn't just dream of making money. They wanted to solve problems unique to their country and prove they could innovate without imitation. Artists created stories that resonated deeply with 1 billion people. Leaders spoke in a tone that reflected national pride rather than colonial hangovers. This new cultural confidence became a unifying force. It inspired resilience during crisis, fueled ambition in the workplace, and emboldened the nation to define success on its own terms. The result was a psychological shift so powerful that it began to ripple across the world. Other nations noticed that India's rise wasn't just economic or military. It was driven by a spirit that refused to be small anymore. And that is why it feels unstoppable. India learned long ago that in a multipolar world, survival and influence depend not just on strength but on strategy. While some nations picked sides in global rivalries, India charted a more complex path, one that confused its critics and unsettled its rivals. Over the last 2 decades, India has developed a foreign policy that is neither rigidly aligned nor easily predicted. This approach, sometimes called strategic autonomy, allows India to pursue its national interests without being pulled into permanent alliances that could limit its freedom of action. Instead of choosing between the United States and Russia, India cultivated partnerships with both. It bought advanced defense systems from Russia, including the S-400 missile defense system, while also signing historic defense cooperation agreements with Washington. It joined the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, known as the Quad, with the US, Japan, and Australia, signaling a shared vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific. At the same time, India has maintained channels of dialogue with China, even amid tense standoffs along the Himalayan border. Some countries expected India to fully decouple from Beijing after the clashes in Ladakh, but India knows that in the real world, economic interdependence and security competition often coexist. Rather than making dramatic breaks, India chose a calibrated approach, restricting Chinese tech companies domestically while keeping diplomatic communication open. This balancing act extends far beyond Asia. India has deepened ties with Europe through trade and green technology partnerships. It has strengthened connections with Israel, especially in areas like defense innovation and cybersecurity. In Africa, India has invested heavily in development, education, and infrastructure, positioning itself as a partner of choice for nations wary of Chinese loans. Part of what makes India's diplomacy so effective is the credibility it has built as a democratic counterweight to authoritarian models. Unlike many emerging powers, India can claim a consistent record of electoral democracy and a commitment to the rule of law, even when these principles are imperfectly applied. This gives New Delhi moral leverage in forums like the G20 and the United Nations. When Indian leaders speak about fairness, equity, and development, many countries in the global south listen because they see India's own journey from poverty to promise. This strategic positioning has also transformed India's image in the eyes of major powers. Washington no longer sees India as merely a regional player, but as a critical partner in containing China's influence. Moscow values India's role as an enduring customer and friend, even as Russia grows closer to Beijing. European capitals increasingly view India as an essential economic and geopolitical counterbalance. For other nations watching, this creates a kind of strategic anxiety. India has options. India has leverage, and India is willing to use both. When it banned dozens of Chinese apps overnight or refused to join certain trade pacts that didn't align with its interests, it showed it wasn't afraid to walk its own path even at economic cost. This unpredictability makes India harder to pressure or isolate. Equally important, India's global influence is amplified by its vast diaspora. Over 30 million people who form powerful bridges in politics, business, academia, and technology. Indian-origin CEO runs some of the world's most iconic companies. Lawmakers of Indian heritage hold office in the US, the UK, Canada, and beyond. These connections extend India's soft power in ways that no treaty or military alliance alone could achieve. Taken together, India's diplomacy is neither submissive nor confrontational. It is strategic, flexible, and driven by a clear purpose to protect India's autonomy and secure a place at every table where the future is decided. This is why so many nations are unsettled, because India cannot be dismissed as a junior partner or corralled into someone else's grand strategy. It is a player writing its own playbook, and it is doing so with remarkable success.